The gates slammed shut with a force that made the hedges tremble. Outside, her children were screaming, pleading, and banging against the iron bars, faces red with desperation and shame. "Mom, please, open the gates," her eldest shouted, tears streaming down his face. Her youngest shook her fists. "We didn't mean it. We need you." Eleanor didn't flinch. She leaned lightly against the polished brass handle, a quiet smile spreading across her face. 4 years, they had demanded, belittled, and abandoned her. 4 years, they had assumed she would quietly fade away, that she would hand over her savings, her home, her life itself without resistance. But Eleanor had learned the hard way that the world owed her nothing. She had learned to take care of herself, to claim her own power, and to reward those who truly stood by her. The once greedy faces outside were the last thing she saw before turning toward the mansion, her heart calm, her mind resolute. Today, the tables had turned. And Eleanor, finally, was in control. Eleanor had never intended to confront her children in this way. She was a woman of quiet dignity, soft-spoken and patient, but also sharp, observant, and fiercely independent. Widowhood had taken her husband decades ago, leaving her alone to navigate a world that often dismissed older women as powerless, invisible, and disposable. Her children, emboldened by selfishness, had seen only what they wanted: her money, her property, and her compliance. They had pressured her to sell her family home, abandon her independence, and move into a sterile apartment where she would be out of the way. They assumed her age meant weakness, her kindness meant obedience, and her love meant exploitation. They were wrong. Eleanor spent years quietly planning her future. While her children squandered their inheritance, laughed at her frugality, and mocked her age, she invested wisely. She sought guidance from trusted neighbors, attended workshops, and started a small bakery that quickly became a local favorite. Every decision she made was calculated, deliberate, and free from the influence of those who had abandoned her. The neighbors, friends, mentors, and strangers who had seen her potential became her allies. They offered advice, labor, and encouragement. Together, they built something lasting: a thriving business, a growing network, and a community of support that her children had never imagined. Her wealth grew quietly, steadily. Real estate investments, small enterprises, and her bakery flourished under her guidance. Each step was a lesson in independence, resilience, and intelligence. Eleanor became stronger, not just financially but emotionally. She had learned that those who abandon you when you are vulnerable cannot be trusted to return when fortunes change. And now, after years of meticulous planning and hard work, the time had come. Her children, once dismissive and cruel, had returned, faces pale with panic, voices trembling with desperation, expecting to reclaim what they had taken for granted. But Eleanor had rewritten the rules. She had chosen her allies, her family by choice, and her rewards would go to those who had truly stood by her. The gates between them were more than iron and steel. They were a barrier between greed and justice, between entitlement and earned respect. And Eleanor, calm and resolute, held the key. Eleanor had spent decades pouring love, care, and resources into her family. She had raised her children with patience, often sacrificing her own comfort so that they could live more comfortably. Birthdays, holidays, late nights waiting up for school projects, they were all memories she cherished. But the gratitude she had expected never materialized. Instead, as the years passed, she realized that appreciation had been replaced by expectation, and love had been replaced by entitlement. Her children no longer visited her without reason. When they did, it was to borrow money, criticize her choices, or remind her of her age and uselessness. She had begun to notice the small jabs disguised as jokes. "Mom, shouldn't you be resting? Don't strain yourself lifting that box. Oh, you bought more groceries? Don't worry about me, just make sure the pantry is stocked for the grandkids." It stung, but Eleanor hid the hurt behind polite smiles and soft nods. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon. Eleanor had been under the weather, and she asked her eldest for a simple favor: help carry some boxes from the garage to the kitchen. The response she received shocked her to the core. "Mom, why don't you just hire someone?" "We've done enough already," he sneered, brushing past her as though she were invisible. The younger child laughed, adding, "Honestly, you're so slow these days." "We can't wait around for you to finish anything." It wasn't just the words, it was the total absence of care, the assumption that she was a burden rather than a parent, a human being. Eleanor felt a familiar ache in her chest, a weight she had carried for years. She realized then that her children had no intention of caring for her, no intention of even respecting her. They expected her to fade quietly, to hand over everything, and to accept their cruelty. That night, Eleanor sat in the living room, rain pattering against the windows, and thought carefully about her next steps. She had always relied on herself, managed the household finances, handled investments, and made careful plans for the future. If her children would not honor her, she could still honor herself. She began by cataloging her resources, savings accounts, a small inheritance from her husband, and the property she owned in town. She researched investments, spoke with financial advisors, and began attending seminars at the local community center. Her quiet determination surprised even her. Each step, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been neglected for decades. At the same time, Eleanor reached out to the neighbors she had always trusted, neighbors who had admired her work ethic and generosity over the years. With their encouragement, she opened a small bakery. It was modest at first, a single oven, a few shelves, a handful of loyal customers, but it became her sanctuary. Her neighbors volunteered to help, sharing recipes, baking techniques, and marketing tips. They were not just business partners, they were allies, friends who respected her and supported her vision. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of community she hadn't known she was missing. The bakery flourished. Word spread through the town about the quality of her bread, the warmth of her pastries, and the kindness of its owner. Orders increased, and Eleanor began reinvesting profits into new ventures, property investments, small businesses, and even stocks. She carefully managed her finances, learning more every day about wealth building and independence. Meanwhile, her children noticed her growing confidence and success, but not in time to influence her. They continued to treat her as a convenience, expecting she would eventually need them. But Eleanor had changed. She was no longer the vulnerable mother who would quietly comply. She had discovered a power she had never realized she possessed: self-reliance, resilience, and strategic foresight. One evening, after closing the bakery, Eleanor sat on her porch and reflected on the journey she had begun. She realized something profound. The betrayal of her children had been painful, yes, but it had also been the spark she needed to reclaim her life. Their absence had forced her to take control, to invest in herself, and to create a life filled with dignity and independence. And in that quiet reflection, a plan began to form. She would not simply succeed for herself, she would rewrite the rules entirely. She would ensure that those who abandoned her would no longer have access to her wealth or influence. She would reward loyalty, kindness, and integrity, showing the world that true family was not always defined by blood, but by those who stand by you in your time of need. The bakery that Eleanor had started almost on a whim became the cornerstone of her newfound independence. At first, it was simple, a small storefront with a few tables, the smell of fresh bread and pastries wafting through the air. She greeted every customer with warmth and care, learning their names, listening to their stories, and offering advice when they asked. Her charm wasn't flashy, it was subtle, sincere, and magnetic. Word spread quickly. Soon, the bakery had regulars from all over town. People would line up early in the morning just to taste her sourdough, her flaky croissants, and her signature apple tarts. Eleanor's reputation for excellence grew, and with it, her confidence. She realized something important. She didn't need her children's approval. She didn't need their validation. The world would recognize her worth if she worked for it, and she did. With the help of her neighbors, she expanded operations. Some helped with baking, others with bookkeeping, and a few offered advice on marketing and managing inventory. They were more than neighbors. They were allies, friends, and, in many ways, a chosen family. Eleanor learned to delegate, to trust, and to lead. Each small decision, each successful day, reinforced her sense of autonomy and self-worth. But Eleanor didn't stop at the bakery. She began investing her profits carefully. Real estate, small startups, and stocks became part of a larger, meticulously planned portfolio. Each investment was a step toward financial security, and toward independence from the children who had once treated her as a burden. She read books on business strategy, attended local financial seminars, and met with advisors she carefully vetted. There were setbacks, of course. Not every investment paid off, and some days the bakery's earnings fell short of expectations. But Eleanor had learned resilience. She didn't panic. She analyzed, adapted, and persevered. Every failure became a lesson, every challenge a stepping stone. Months turned into years, and the results were undeniable. Eleanor's income grew, her savings multiplied, and the small bakery had expanded into a thriving business with multiple locations. Her modest apartment became a mansion, tasteful, elegant, and filled with the things she loved. Art, books, and memories of her late husband filled the rooms. Her life was no longer defined by what her children wanted or expected. It was defined by her vision, her determination, and her hard work. As her wealth grew, Eleanor also gave back. She supported her neighbors, funded local schools, and helped struggling businesses in town. She became a figure of admiration and respect. People didn't just see her as successful. They saw her as wise, compassionate, and unstoppable. Meanwhile, her children had begun to notice the transformation, but too late. They had assumed she would grow frail and dependent, that she would quietly hand over everything they demanded. Instead, they were confronted with a woman who had taken control of her life, reshaped her destiny, and thrived without them. One evening, as Eleanor reviewed the books for her latest expansion, her eldest called. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. We've made some mistakes. Can we come by?" Eleanor listened quietly, her fingers resting on the ledger. A small smile crept across her face. "I'll consider it," she said simply, her tone calm but firm. "I'll see you when the time is right." Inside, she felt no fear, no panic. She had learned that power came not from threats or demands, but from preparation, patience, and self-reliance. Her children had underestimated her, and that underestimation had given her the strength to build a life they could never take from her. At night, she would walk the halls of her mansion, reflecting on the journey. She remembered the nights she felt powerless, the days she endured mockery, and the moments she doubted herself. And she felt pride, not arrogance, but quiet pride, for every step she had taken to reclaim her life. She knew that her ultimate decision lay ahead: how to handle the children who had abandoned her, and how to ensure that her wealth and legacy would go to those who deserved it. But for now, Eleanor allowed herself to savor her independence, her accomplishments, and the knowledge that she had turned betrayal into triumph. The stage was set. Her children, once dismissive and cruel, were waiting. And Eleanor, empowered and unafraid, would soon rewrite the rules entirely. The gates of Eleanor's mansion gleamed in the afternoon sun, tall and imposing, a symbol of the life she had built with her own hands. Birds chirped in the gardens, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the faint aroma of baked bread from the bakery below. Inside, Eleanor moved calmly through her halls, reviewing her accounts and sipping tea, entirely at peace. Then came the knock. Or rather, the banging. Outside the gates, her children, once dismissive, once cruel, stood pleading. Faces pale, clothes disheveled, voices strained. "Mom, please. Open the gates," her eldest cried. "We were wrong. We need you," the youngest added, tears streaming down her cheeks. They had expected her to be frail, to cower under their pleas, to hand over the fortune they had long assumed was theirs. They had not anticipated the Eleanor who stood behind the gates, a woman strong, composed, and completely in control. Eleanor approached the window overlooking the driveway and observed them carefully. She saw the desperation in their eyes, the shame that now replaced their entitlement. She felt neither anger nor malice, only a quiet sense of justice. "You abandoned me," she said softly, her voice carrying across the courtyard so they could hear. "You assumed I would fade quietly and hand over everything you wanted. You were wrong." Her eldest tried to speak, stammering, "Mom, we didn't mean it. We." "No," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "You didn't mean it when I needed you. You didn't care when I was struggling. And now you want what you never earned." She walked slowly to the gates, her posture regal, her expression calm yet unyielding. She did not open them. Instead, she held the brass handle lightly and let them feel the weight of rejection, not cruelly, but firmly, the way a teacher might close a lesson that has been ignored one too many times. Her children's cries grew louder, more frantic. "Mom, please. We need your help. We've changed." Eleanor shook her head. "No. I will not reward greed or abandonment. My life, my wealth, and my legacy will go to those who stood by me, my neighbors, my friends, and the people who helped me build a life worth living. Inside, she thought of Mrs. Thompson, who had helped her with deliveries when her bakery first opened. Of Mr. Lee, who had invested time in teaching her business strategies. Of the young baker apprentices who had believed in her vision when no one else did. These were the people who deserved her generosity, not those who had abandoned her. As she spoke, her children began to realize the truth. They had lost more than just her wealth. They had lost her respect and love. Their pleas became increasingly desperate, but Eleanor remained resolute. With a quiet smile, she whispered to herself, "This is the life I built, with or without you." That evening, after the children had finally left, humiliated and rejected, Eleanor reviewed the new will she had drafted. Every asset, every property, every penny would go to those who had stood by her, who had shown loyalty, compassion, and kindness. She left nothing for the children who had abandoned her, ensuring that their greed would be met with the consequences they deserved. Word of the confrontation and Eleanor's generosity spread quickly. Neighbors rejoiced, strangers celebrated, and the community hailed her not only as a successful businesswoman but as a symbol of resilience, justice, and empowerment. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate the failure of her children. She simply enjoyed her life, her mansion, her bakery, her business ventures, and the people who truly mattered. For the first time, she felt completely free. And then she had an idea, a way to give back even further. Inspired by the support she had received and the lessons she had learned, Eleanor started a YouTube channel and a small online platform. She shared her story openly, the betrayal by her children, the steps she took to reclaim her life, and the businesses she built with her neighbors' support. Her channel quickly gained traction. Elderly viewers from across the country wrote to her, thanking her for sharing her journey. Many had experienced similar neglect, abuse, or abandonment, and Eleanor's story gave them hope. She offered practical advice, emotional support, and a living example that age, betrayal, or adversity did not mean the end of one's dreams. Through the platform, she connected with more people, found new friends, and even discovered opportunities to expand her businesses further. Her life became not only a testament to her resilience but also a beacon for others who had been dismissed, abandoned, or underestimated. Eleanor's children, meanwhile, remained a cautionary tale. They had returned expecting to inherit, but instead they faced the consequences of their neglect and greed. The gates had closed on them forever, but Eleanor's gates had opened to a world of possibility, generosity, and freedom. And as she watched the sunset over her mansion, Eleanor felt a deep, lasting satisfaction. She had endured betrayal, rebuilt her life, and created a legacy that would outlast greed and selfishness. Her story was no longer one of abandonment. It was one of empowerment, justice, and hope.